Welcome to Making with Mark. In this video, I'll show you how I took this protein shake bottle and turned it into one of the new droids from Star Wars Bad Batch. This was a super exciting project, and I hope you'll stay tuned to see how I made it. Let's get started. So the first time I saw this protein shake bottle, I immediately thought robot. And if you look at it, it has a lot of interesting features. It has some cool tapers. I like how the top sort of tapers back up, and just the lid and everything just looks like it should be a robot. So if you've seen the new Star Wars animated series Bad Batch, you may have seen this new droid that was introduced. It's called the Vanguard Access Clan, and these particular droids. And the moment I saw that droid, I was like, oh, that's so cool. And then seeing this bottle just reminded me of it. So I knew I wanted to build one. So here, like usual, I'm getting started just cutting the pieces of the bottle loose that I don't need. And some of these I'll actually repurpose. The top section of this bottle really reminds me of the upper body of the Access droid. So here I'm just removing this label. That'll get us down to just some bare plastic that we can work with. And then I use my grinding wheel and just sort of cleaned up that top. And then followed that with some sandpaper just to smooth it out a bit. And obviously that's not going to work. That's a little better. So after cleaning up the top and getting it ready, went ahead and marked some lines for the shoulders, and the bottle made it really easy. If you look closely, you can see the seam on both sides. So I just basically followed that seam, and this will help me line up the holes for the shoulders. So I'll go ahead and just kind of roughly mark out those locations. I'll come back later and drill those. Now on this particular droid, the arms sort of attach into the body. They don't mount on the outside like some other robots. So that's the reason for drilling the hole and opening this up. And you'll see in a moment how I put some filler on the inside of the body of the robot, and then I'm able to sort of grind that out and remove it. And then I'll have a great place to mount the arms. And here I've opened the hole up with a couple different size drill bits, and I use my sanding wheel again just to make that nice and clean and round. And then I went to one of several sort of parts bins that I keep, and I found this cool ring. This is a plumbing part, but it fit almost perfect to the body. And I need something here for this location to be able to tie the lower part of the body into the upper. And after kind of toying around with this a little bit, I figured out that inserting it into the upper part was even better. I had the perfect reveal, and it fit just right. So then it's on to another sort of junk box here of things. And I have these ping pong balls. These are really handy for making robots and other little things. And at first I thought that would work, but it just wasn't quite as wide as I wanted it to be. It needed to be a little wider. So I have these fishing corks, and that was just right. You can see it's a little bit wider than the ping pong ball. And it has another feature that is really going to be handy. It's the fact that it has the ridge where the white and red meet is going to play right into the details for this droid. The first thing I want to do is scuff up the plastic on this fishing bobber, and that's to help with adhesion. So I sand both pieces, and then I use my cutting wheel and the Dremel and just sort of cut some little notches on the inside of this plumbing fitting. And this is going to promote adhesion. It'll give the glue something to sort of grab a hold of. Then I add some glue to the inside edge, and then go ahead and set the bobber exactly where I want it. And then once that sets a little bit, I add some baking powder. And this is just to really lock in and dry out the super glue very rapidly. I reinforced the inside as well. And I mainly did this because the two materials are two different types of plastic. The plumbing part is sort of more of a rubbery feel, and of course the bobber is a hard plastic. So I wanted to make sure they stayed together. And then fitting the pieces together proved to be a little more difficult because the plumbing part was now more rigid. But here you can see kind of how that's going to look. I was very pleased with the way it was going so far. So again, use the Dremel and the cutting wheel, and I'm just scoring these little ridges on the outside of the plumbing piece, and that will again give me a good holding surface that I can put glue on, and that will stick really well to the inside of the upper body. So once I have that set where I want it, again, more glue and more of that baking powder. And once I had the top and bottom pieces of the torso together, I went ahead and put some reference marks on it. And this is just to help me figure out where to place some of the details. Of course, the arms, which I've already gotten holes for. But I also wanted to identify the front of the robot, and then go ahead and start to draw in some reference lines that will help me figure out where the legs are going to attach. And the legs on this droid are also unique, much like the arms. They're sort of sunk in. The connection piece on the bottom of the body is sort of sunk in. It doesn't just sit on the surface. So I marked out the sections that will need to be cut away. And then once I'm happy with that, I go ahead with the cutting wheel again and just cut these pieces out. And with both of these slots cut into the bottom of the robot, now I need to clean up those cut lines, and you can see that hard plastic bobber leaves a lot of burrs and rough edges, so more sanding wheel and a little bit of hand sanding, and then it was looking pretty good. Now, in order to not waste a whole bunch of epoxy putty, I'm using some tin foil here just as a filler, and this is a neat little trick that you can do. Again, I could easily just pack this whole cavity full of epoxy putty, but it's rather expensive, and if I don't have to do that, why waste it? Then once I have that ready, I just took some small pieces, inserted them on each side, pressed them in, and I'm mostly just trying to get a sort of a rough concave shape. Doesn't have to be perfect because I'm going to come back and use the sanding wheel again and do a little bit of hand sanding. And this part of the robot is not going to be, really visible. It's going to be mostly covered, but I still wanted to get that detail just because it's, a very noticeable part of the design of the droid. And then once I had that finished, in the spirit of not wasting, I had a little bit of leftover putty, and so I'm kind of planning ahead here. Didn't want to just waste it, so I rolled these small little balls of putty. And these actually are going to play a key part towards the very end of this project. I mixed up a little bit more of the epoxy putty, and this is to work on the arm section of the robot. And just like the lower part, the arms are going to attach sort of to the inside of the body, and so I pressed this from the inside out. And again, it's not perfect, but that's fine. I actually wanted it to protrude just a little bit so that I can sand it down later. So I broke down a couple of magic markers and dry erase markers, and I'm going to use these for arms and legs. It's a super handy thing to do if you have some old dried out markers, especially. You basically just cut the ends off, then I use a pair of pliers to pull the dyed piece from the inside just so I don't get ink all over me. And here you can see one of the dry erase ones. And then once you have all the inside pieces out of it, you can sort of cut them to size. They sand very easy, just very simple to work with. After looking at the reference photos of the droid, you'll notice that the upper part of the legs have this sort of stacked appearance, and I want to recreate that using some washers. So I broke out my collection of metal and plastic washers, tried a few until I found one that fit just right. And once I got that one glued on, I went ahead and found one the next step smaller, and then I glued it on. And then I follow that up by one more, even smaller, stacked on top of that. And I thought this did a really good job of recreating the look that I was going for. Using some plastic washers and little pieces of pipe, I made some of these connectors, and they're going to fit right on top of the leg portions, and that'll help tie it to the body. And here you can see how that's going to match up. Back to the reference photo again. It's time to start looking at the upper arm pieces. And these were a little tricky. I looked around, I couldn't find anything that would fit this, so I decided to make my own. I took some little strips of MDF. If you don't know what that is, it stands for medium density fiberboard. It's sort of like a particle board. It's very easy to work with. You can shape it, grind it, cut it. So I made a couple of pieces for the upper arm. Went ahead and then started assembling the lower arm. These are repurposed magic markers. I found, two that fit just right, one slipping inside of the other. And once I got those glued up, went ahead and cut this notch out of the top, cleaned that up a little bit. And here you can see how the upper arm and the lower arm are going to fit together, again using some of those little connector pieces. The upper arm actually fastens to the lower arm with two little rods. I used some scrap copper wire for this. I went ahead and built out the other arm. It has a slight bend. Other than that, it's the same. And now to get the taper where the wrist is, I mixed up some more of that 2-part epoxy putty, and then I just shaped it sort of at a slant. There's more details on the forearm. There's a couple of different sections that bump out, and I thought sculpting these would be by far the easiest thing to do. And this is where Milliput really shines. Now moving on, taking a look at the reference photo, we can see the droid's head. It's a pretty unique shape. Of course, you've got the cylindrical bottom part, and then you have the sort of domed upper part. And before I can really finish the head of the robot, I need to go ahead and fill the gap in the top of the body. So I'm using some styrene. I just glue that on. I cut it a little bit oversized so that I could sand it down nice and smooth. And then I used this plastic washer to sort of act like a collar, and this is to give some separation from the body of the robot to the head. And I'll add some more pieces in here to do more of that later. And then it's on to another piece of styrene, and this will go on the underside of the cap. So I just scuffed that up using some sandpaper, glued it together, and then more of that sanding. And there you have a nice smooth piece of styrene attached to the lid. And I just tried a couple different mock-ups here using some plastic pipe. And now onto the dome portion. I cut out one of these ping pong balls. Started off just cutting it in half. And then after sort of looking at it and just sort of putting it on the body of the robot, standing back, taking a look, I decided to take more off of it. And in hindsight, I probably could have taken even more off, but at this point, it fit pretty good. I was happy with the look, and overall, I think it turned out really well. Once I had that the size that I wanted, went ahead and glued it up, attached it, and there you have it. Now moving on to the lower legs, I found these pen caps. These are some old ink pens, and found out that if I cut the little clip off of the end of it, what that left me with is this perfect shin piece. You can see how that's going to fit. And I made some more of those little connector pieces again. and then started mocking up what I wanted that to look like. Here I'm using some plastic pipe just to attach the two, and you can see the legs are really starting to come along. Now back to the reference photo, I really didn't have a good view of the droid's feet. This is one of the only shots that I could find, really. So I took some artistic freedom here and sort of customized my own. And I started off by just using the leg. This is very unscientific here, right? Low tech. So I just held it up, just sort of eyeballed what I thought would look right, and then I cut that out of styrene. And I used a little thicker styrene here because I wanted it to really be strong. I just started kind of mocking up the first leg. Got those pieces glued together. And once I was happy with the design, I went ahead and duplicated that. And then I started working on the hands. And you can see how the hands are going to look attached to the body. I was very happy with the way that turned out. Now it's time to start refining the shape of that putty on the forearm. This took quite a bit of sanding. The putty is really fun and easy to work with. It creates quite a dusty mess, so just a word of advice: if you're going to do this, make sure you wear a respirator, and preferably do this outside if you can. If not, make sure you've got a vacuum cleaner or some kind of ventilation going. But this does allow you to get the exact shape that you're looking for. Once I was happy with the overall shape, I used some more of that filler, some more sanding, and I got it really smooth. Now it's time to attach the hands. I used a washer in between to sort of fill a gap and make it look more like the original photo. Then did some sanding on the head. Again, use some of that filler just to fill gaps and to make it very smooth. Here's the end result. I was very happy with the way that looked and went ahead and started adding some details. These are some pieces of styrene and actually some little necklace beads. I like to use these as little eyes and rivets and things like that. After some more primer on the different parts of the robot, it's time to attach the legs, and I built these almost like chain link pieces out of styrene and more of that plastic tubing. And here he is for the first time assembled, of course just in primer, so there's a lot of detail left. And after a coat of paint, we're starting to look more like a droid. I added some bits and pieces there you'll see on the feet and just sort of build out some more of the detail all the way around the robot. And this will give us something to sort of distress and age. It'll make a really nice look. Now the first little bit of detail color here is going to be this gold metallic. And if you've seen any of my other videos, you know I love this color, and especially with this turquoise on the robot. I'm going to tone down some of the brightness of the gold, but I definitely want to get this layer on there. So moving around across the body of the robot, I use the reference photo again to kind of figure out which parts should be this gold color. And like I said, some of it I'm going to mute with some brown and some of the distressing wash later. I use some white acrylic paint. On the droid, on his chest, he has this sort of logo or insignia, and I wanted to reproduce that. And also, there's this collar that goes all the way around the top of him. That's also white. I took some brown paint and started working in some of these joint areas. And you can imagine this being rusty and dirty and grungy. And that's the look I was going for. And I also used some jet black paint in some of the darker areas and for some of these details. Especially on the head, there's a few different pieces here that are black and some of them are silver. I don't really want those to pop. Adding in some of the silver details. And then I mixed up this darker turquoise color with some acrylic that I had. And the idea here is to sort of create a distinction between the base coat of spray paint and this darker coat. And this is going to be sort of the weathered, distressed look. It's really going to make it just come to life. So I'm just sort of blotching this on. I'm not trying to cover everything, and I'm actually wiping most of that color back off, but you can see what happens. It's a real nice contrast, and it immediately makes the robot look aged and worn, and that's exactly the look I'm going for. And we're going to keep layering and doing this with that dark turquoise color, and then I come back and stipple some of that white acrylic. And again, I'm just being rough with it. I'm not covering everything. I'm just picking and choosing some little spots, and then I'm wiping away most of that. But it gives you this really cool weathered look. And I made a wash of some brown and black and kind of watered it down. I'm hitting some of those creases and corners. I want to work this into especially the lower areas, the feet, all the joints where these connections, these links are. Definitely want to work that in, and I'm just trying to take the newness off of it. Any bright paint I want to sort of mask and cover, and that's just part of the aging. You can see I've sort of toned down some of that gold, and I finish up with a little bit of silver. This is just a dry brushing technique, and it's just icing on the cake. I was really happy with the way this turned out. Now, moving on, a couple last bit of details here. This was pretty fun, actually. I had some leftover vinyl fabric, and I thought that would be great to make this bandolier on the front of the robot. So I cut some strips out, just sort of draped it across them to figure out the size. I actually ended up cutting several different pieces, and now I get to use those little pieces of putty that I rolled into balls earlier. By now they're really hard. And those are going to make the perfect little thermal detonators. I'm going to use those here in a moment. But first, I need to make this vinyl look like leather. So I paint some brown acrylic onto it, let it dry. And then I pin it in place with some super glue, drape it across his chest, and then glue it again. And then I work in this larger, wider underpiece to sort of mimic the look from the reference photos again. And then once I had that one side, I just reproduced the same effect with the other strap. And here I'm gluing in those thermal detonators, or grenades if you will. And I just used another piece of that vinyl to make it look like a little leather holder that goes over the top. So once I added these in, got them glued down, went ahead and trimmed the excess vinyl. And I was very, very happy with the way the bandolier turned out. Only a few final details to go here. I added some more of those beads in to create the eye on the front of his head. Then I put the little tops on the thermal detonators. Did some final touch-up and distressing, and that pretty much wraps up one of my favorite projects so far. You enjoyed this video? Check out these other two that I think you'll also enjoy.